The hands were more than just tired. They were vibrating with a frequency that only a half year of 10-hour shifts could produce. At Station 47, the world didn't exist in maps or general's orders. It existed in the microscopic gap between a steel spring and a grip safety. It was March 1918. Inside the massive Colt Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company in Hartford, Connecticut, the air didn't belong to the living. It was a thick, suffocating fog of whale oil, acrid gun grease, and the metallic tang of shaved carbon steel that seemed to colonize your lungs with every breath. The woman at Station 47 was a ghost in the machine. Her fingers, calloused until they felt like leather, fumbled a tiny coiled spring, a component no larger than a grain of rice, yet vital enough to stop a heart. It clattered. A sharp, rhythmic metallic ping against the oil-slicked concrete floor. In the deafening roar of 10,000 lathes, that tiny sound felt like a thunderclap. She froze. Time in the Hartford plant was measured in seconds, but those seconds were owned by the men in suits 3 stations away, the supervisors who saw every dropped part as a wound to the American war effort. High above the assembly line, the legendary blue onion dome of the Colt factory acted as a silent witness, catching the pale, anemic light of a New England morning. Beneath that dome, a specialized army of 10,000 civilians was attempting to do the impossible, to manufacture a miracle out of raw iron. She knelt, her skirt dragging through a sea of razor-sharp metal shavings. She found the spring, wiped the industrial grime onto her fabric, and forced her trembling fingers back into the rhythm. She wasn't thinking about the Great War in the abstract. She was thinking about a specific boy from the cornfields of Iowa, a boy whose name she would never know, who was currently shivering in a waterlogged trench in France. If that spring was seated a fraction of a millimetre off, if the grip safety failed during a frantic reload in the mud of the Meuse Argonne, that boy wouldn't just lose his weapon, he would lose his life. This was the terrifying reality of the M1911. It was a masterpiece of engineering that demanded a level of precision that human hands weren't designed to maintain for 60 hours a week. This is the untold chronicle of how the United States transformed from a second-rate industrial power into the arsenal of democracy. It is the story of a factory that was forced to mutate, growing from a modest workforce of 2,400 to a sprawling 24-hour industrial titan of 10,000 souls in less than 18 months. It is the story of 425,000 pistols, each one a mechanical promise, each one a testament to an entire nation, betting its survival on the thousandth of an inch. Before we descend further into the grease and the fire of the Hartford forges, I want to ask you something. History is often written by the victors, but it is built by the workers whose names never make it to the monuments. If you believe these stories of human sweat and mechanical genius deserve to be heard, please subscribe. When we exist to rescue these moments from the archives and bring the human truth of the past into the light of the present. The clock had begun ticking long before that woman dropped the spring. 13 months earlier, in the cold April of 1917, a telegram had arrived at the desk of the president of Colt. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. The War Department was blunt. The current supply of sidearms was a joke. To win in Europe, they needed hundreds of thousands of M1911s, and they needed them before the first transport ships cleared the New York harbor. Up until that moment, Colt had produced a little over 68,000 pistols since the weapon's adoption in 1911. Combined with the output from Springfield Armory, The total US inventory hovered around 100,000. In a world of 19th century warfare, that might have been enough. But President Woodrow Wilson wasn't building a frontier constabulary. He was conjuring a modern juggernaut of 2 million men. The math of industrial warfare was brutal and unforgiving. Even if you only armed every fourth soldier with a pistol, officers, machine gunners, medics, tunnel rats, you still needed 500,000 units. If you armed everyone who actually needed a close-quarters lifesaver, the number climbed toward 1 million. Colt's production rate at the time, 150 pistols per day. If they stayed at that pace, the war would be a memory, and the map of Europe would be redrawn in German ink long before the millionth pistol was boxed. The government didn't ask Colt if they could scale up. They ordered them to. They handed out contracts for 2.7 million pistols to anyone with a lathe and a dream. But there was a catch. Only one company actually knew how to build a 1911. Only one company held the institutional soul of John Moses Browning's masterpiece. The M1911 wasn't just a gun. It was a complex puzzle of 58 moving parts that had to survive being frozen, baked, submerged in salt water, and dragged through the filth of a world at war. In 1910, during the legendary trials, Browning's prototype had fired 6,000 rounds without a single malfunction. The barrel had glowed like a dying star, yet it kept cycling. That level of reliability wasn't accidental. It was a result of tolerances so tight they bordered on the obsessive. The barrel had to lock into the slide with the perfection of a vault door. The disconnector had to manage the violent energy of a .45 CP round without jamming the mechanism. If any of those 58 parts varied by the thickness of a human hair, the weapon was a paperweight. And Samuel Colt's greatest legacy, the principle of interchangeability, was now the factory's greatest curse. Every part made in Hartford in March had to fit perfectly into a pistol frame made in November. A slide made by a subcontractor in Quebec had to mate perfectly with a receiver forged in Connecticut. To meet this demand, the factory on Hendrickson Avenue had to expand like a living organism. They bought up every inch of adjacent land. Construction crews worked under floodlights, pouring concrete while the machines inside never stopped humming. By the summer of 1917, the floor space had grown by a third, filled with new drop forges that shook the very foundations of Hartford, and milling machines that screamed like banshees as they bit into hardened steel. But machines are just cold iron without the heat of human labour. Connecticut was a state stripped of its men. The draft was hollowing out the towns. Winchester was desperate for rifle makers. Remington was hoovering up every available machinist for ammunition. Colt needed something more than just workers. They needed precision artists who could work in a furnace. They turned to a labour force they had previously ignored. They hired the women. What began as a trickle in the inspection departments soon became a flood on the assembly lines. These weren't society girls looking for a patriotic thrill. These were working-class women from the river towns, women who needed the wages and whose brothers were already face down in French mud. By 1918, if you walked through the gates past the Blue Dome, you wouldn't see a brotherhood of craftsmen. You would see a sisterhood of steel. They wore caps to keep their hair from being ripped out by the belt-driven lathes. They wore long skirts that collected the oil and the shavings. They worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in a symphony of pneumatic hammers and grinding wheels that left their ears ringing for a lifetime. They were the ones fitting the grip safeties. They were the ones rifling the barrels, cutting 4 perfect spiral grooves into the bore to give the point 4.5 caliber bullet the spin it needed to stabilize its flight. If the rifling was off by a fraction, the pistol was useless. If the heat treatment was too brittle, the slide would shatter like glass. The pressure was volcanic. The unions, the IAM, and the metal polishers looked at these women with suspicion, seeing them as a threat to their power. But management didn't care about union politics, they cared about quotas. 150 a day became 500. 500 became 1,000. By the height of the push, a finished M1911 was rolling off the line every single minute. Think about that. 58 parts, machined to the thousandth of an inch, inspected, assembled, and test-fired every 60 seconds. It was a miracle of human endurance and industrial will, and it was all resting on the shaking hands of people like the woman at Station 47. The telegram that landed on the desk of Colt's leadership in April 1917 didn't just carry ink. It carried the weight of an entire nation's survival. It was a cold, clinical document, stripped of all diplomatic niceties. The United States had officially entered the war to end all wars, and the War Department had a realization that bordered on panic. Their army was effectively unarmed for the horrors of modern trench warfare. At that precise moment, the US military was an antique. For an army of 200,000 men, the existing stock of 100,000 M1911 pistols, split between Colt's Hartford plant and the government-owned Springfield Armory, seemed adequate. But President Woodrow Wilson wasn't looking to send a small expeditionary force. He was calling for a Leviathan of 2 million soldiers. The mathematics were not just unforgiving, they were brutal. If you looked at the anatomy of a 1917 division, the pistol was no longer a decorative piece for cavalry officers. In the claustrophobic, mud-choked trenches of France, a long-barreled rifle was often a liability. Machine gun crews, mortar teams, signal corps, and the terrifying trench raiders needed a weapon that could stop a charging enemy at 10 yards with a single, devastating punch. The requirement was simple. 1 pistol for every 4 men. The total: 500,000 units immediately. The ultimate goal? Over 2 million. Now look at the reality inside the brick walls of the Hartford factory. In early 1917, the master craftsmen at Colt were producing approximately 150 pistols in a 24-hour cycle. If they maintained that pace, it would take them nearly 40 years to fulfill the government's request. And by the time the millionth pistol left the factory, the war would have been over for decades, and the men who needed them would be long buried. The War Department didn't care about possible. They issued contracts for 2.7 million pistols, spreading them out like seeds in a field, hoping someone, anyone, could grow them. They approached Remington, North American Arms, and even companies that had never seen a gun blueprint in their lives. National Cash Register, Savage Arms, and even the Burroughs Adding Machine Company. But as the dust settled, a stark truth emerged. You cannot simply decide to build a 1911. You cannot buy the soul of John Moses Browning's masterpiece with a government check. The M1911 was a mechanical enigma. It required specialized jigs, custom-made gauges, and, most importantly, institutional memory. You needed men, and now women, who understood why a certain piece of steel needed to be quenched at a specific temperature, or why a certain lug on the barrel needed a microscopic bevel that wasn't even visible on the original blueprints. Colt stood alone at the center of this storm. they were the only ones who had spent 6 years perfecting the manufacturing flow. The president of Colt knew that this wasn't an opportunity to get rich. It was a death warrant if they failed. To meet the quota, they would have to increase production by 1,000%. Not 10%, not 100%, 1,000%. The first casualty of this expansion was the physical limit of the factory itself. The Hendrickson Avenue complex was already a labyrinth. To survive, it had to grow like a cancer. Construction crews were hired in the thousands. They didn't just build, they terraformed. New foundations were poured while the existing machines were still running, the vibration of the jackhammers competing with the rhythm of the lathes. Millions of dollars in capital investment, money that didn't exist in the company's coffers, was poured into new equipment. Huge railroad cars arrived daily, carrying massive drop forges from the Midwest, machines so heavy they required their own reinforced concrete pads. If the war ended early or if the government cancelled the contracts, Colt would cease to exist. They were betting the entire 60-year legacy of Samuel Colt on the hope that they could master the art of the impossible scale. And then there was the problem of the gauges. In 1917, there was no digital precision. Everything was checked by go/no-go gauges, hardened steel templates that determined if a part was perfect or trash. Colt needed thousands of these gauges, each one a masterwork of tool-making in its own right. Without them, the principle of interchangeability was dead. Imagine a soldier in a foxhole in 1918. His pistol jams because a piece of grit broke the firing pin. He reaches into a crate of spare parts manufactured by a different company 3,000 miles away. If that pin is too long by 0.002 inches, it won't fit. If it's too short, it won't fire. In either case, the soldier dies. Colt became the mother plant. They were forced to share their most guarded secrets, their blueprints, their manufacturing sequences, their very DNA, with competitors like Remington and Winchester. It was industrial heresy. But the survival of the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, demanded it. As the winter of 1917 approached, the pressure inside the Hartford plant became physical. The workforce was ballooning. Every day, hundreds of new recruits stood at the gates, immigrants from Italy and Poland, farm boys from the valley, and a growing number of determined women. They were being fed into a machine that never slept. The factory was no longer a workplace. It was a 24-hour city of fire and steel. 3 shifts. The lights behind the brick-arched windows never went out. The rumble of the Connecticut River was drowned out by the constant rhythmic thud of the forges, a heartbeat of war that could be felt in the floorboards of houses 3 miles away. This was the moment of truth. The blueprints were ready. The machines were humming. The workers were in place, but could they actually do it? Could they turn a handcrafted masterpiece into a mass-produced icon without losing the very quality that made it legendary? If you're fascinated by how a single factory can change the course of global history, make sure you've hit that subscribe button. In the next chapter, we're going into the alchemist's kitchen, the assembly line where 58 pieces of raw steel were transformed into the most trusted sidearm in military history. To understand the M1911, you have to understand the mind of John Moses Browning. He didn't just design a gun, he solved a problem of physics that had plagued firearms for centuries. Before the 1911, semi-automatic pistols were fragile, complicated, and prone to jamming when they met the reality of mud and blood. Browning, a man who thought in 4 dimensions, saw a different path. He saw a weapon that breathed. Deep within the Hartford plant, in the quietest room of the engineering wing, the blueprints were treated with a reverence usually reserved for religious relics. The 1911 was built around a short recoil system, a revolutionary concept where the barrel and the slide locked together for a fraction of a second after firing, allowing the massive pressure of the .45A CP round to dissipate safely before the action cycled. It was a violent, mechanical dance that happened in milliseconds. The hammer strikes the firing pin, the primer ignites the powder. A 230-grain lead bullet is propelled down the rifled barrel at 800 feet per second. At that moment, the recoil is so powerful it would shatter a fixed barrel design. But Browning's barrel tilted. It dropped just enough to unlock the slide, letting the recoil energy do the work of extracting the spent casing and feeding a fresh round from the 7-round magazine. This was the genius of the design, simplicity born from complexity. But the real miracle, the one that allowed the factory to produce 1,000 units a day, was Samuel Colt's obsession with interchangeability. In the mid-1800s, Samuel Colt had envisioned a world where a broken part didn't mean a useless gun. By 1918, that vision was being tested to its absolute limit. The interchangeability miracle meant that a barrel forged in Hartford, a slide machined in Springfield, and a hammer cast by a subcontractor in Ohio had to fit together with a precision of 0.001 inches. If you think that's easy, try doing it with early 20th century technology. There were no computers. There were no laser sensors. There was only the master gauge, a set of hardened steel blocks kept in a temperature-controlled vault. These were the DNA of the M1911. Every gauge used on the factory floor was checked against these masters. If a gauge wore down by even the thickness of a spider's silk, it was melted down and recast. The assembly floor was a place of intense silence amidst the roar of the factory. Here, fitters stood at wooden benches, or their job was to take 58 separate parts from 58 different bins and turn them into a living weapon. A master fitter didn't just use their eyes, they used their ears. They would rack the slide, clack, clack, listening for a specific metallic ring. A dry sound meant the tolerances were too tight. A hollow sound meant they were too loose. This was where the soul was added. The M1911 was more than the sum of its parts. It was a balance of spring tension, friction, and inertia. If the recoil spring was too weak, the gun would beat itself to death. If it was too strong, it wouldn't cycle. The women and men on the assembly line became human computers, their muscles memorizing the exact amount of force needed to pin the sear or seat the mainspring housing. But why the .45 caliber? The War Department was haunted by the failure of the .38 caliber revolvers in the Philippines. They wanted stopping power. They wanted a bullet that would drop a charging enemy instantly, even if it didn't hit a vital organ. The .45 ACP automatic Colt pistol round was a massive, slow-moving slug, the mechanical equivalent of being hit by a sledgehammer. Browning designed the 1911 to handle that violence. He gave it a grip angle that felt like a natural extension of the human hand, the pointability that shooters still praise 100 years later. He gave it a slide lock that told the soldier exactly when they were empty, and a thumb safety that could be operated in the dark, under fire, with frostbitten fingers. This was the weapon that the Hartford factory was churning out at a rate of 1 per minute. It was a masterpiece of mass production. But as 1918 ground on, the factory was facing a new crisis. The steel was coming in faster than they could forge it. The coal for the furnaces was running low. And most importantly, the human cost was beginning to show. In the next chapter, we will step away from the blueprints and look into the eyes of the people who built these legends, the Sisters of Steel, and the men who fought the unions to keep the fires burning. We will see the blood on the factory floor that mirrored the blood in the trenches. By the spring of 1918, the demographic landscape of the Hartford factory had undergone a seismic shift. The traditional brotherhood of machinists was being replaced by a sisterhood of necessity. As the American Expeditionary Forces sucked the young men of Connecticut into the meat grinder of the Western Front, the gates of Colt swung open for a workforce they had spent half a century keeping at arm's length. Women. This wasn't a soft transition. The factory floor in 1918 was a sensory assault. It was a forest of leather belts, reaching from the ceiling to the floor, driving thousands of lathes with a deafening, rhythmic slap and whir. The air was a cocktail of vaporized oil and fine metallic dust that settled on everything: skin, clothes, and lungs. Into this inferno stepped the women of the Connecticut River Valley. Or they were called lady soldiers in the propaganda posters, but the reality was far less glamorous. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore heavy denim aprons and tightly bound caps to prevent their hair from being caught in the drive belts. A gruesome accident that happened more often than the company dared to admit. They worked 10-hour shifts, often standing on concrete floors that radiated the cold of a New England winter or the sweltering humidity of a Hartford summer. At first, the male supervisors, veterans of the trade who believed that gunsmithing required a masculine intuition, relegated women to the simplest tasks: cleaning parts, inspection, and packaging. But as the quotas climbed from 500 to 1,000 pistols a day, the barrier collapsed. Women began operating the heavy drop forges. They handled the white-hot steel billets, and their faces shielded from the sparks by makeshift masks. They operated the precision milling machines, cutting the delicate grooves for the slide stop and the thumb safety with a focus that often surpassed their male predecessors. But the social friction was as hot as the forges. The labour unions, particularly the International Association of Machinists, IAM, viewed these women with a mixture of fear and contempt. To the union men, women were dilution labour, unskilled workers who would drive down wages and weaken the bargaining power of the craft. There were whispers of sabotage, and the atmosphere in the cafeteria was often as cold as the steel outside. Yet, the Colt women had a motivation that the unions couldn't quantify. Most of them had a brother, a husband, or a son in the 102nd Infantry Regiment, the Yankee Division. For them, every M1911 that passed final inspection wasn't just a unit of production. It was a life insurance policy for a loved one. They knew that if a barrel was bored incorrectly, or if a trigger pull was too heavy, it could be their own husband who paid the price in a trench 5,000 miles away. This emotional stakes drove a level of quality control that was unprecedented. Records from 1918 show that the rejection rate for parts actually dropped as more women entered the inspection departments. Their smaller hands were better suited for the intricate assembly of the firing pin spring and the sear spring, the clockwork heart of the 1911. However, the cost of this industrial miracle was paid in blood and exhaustion. The blue onion dome of the factory became a symbol of a relentless master. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The flu pandemic of 1918 began to sweep through the crowded shop floors. Yet the machines never stopped. Women would faint from exhaustion or fever, only to be replaced by the next person in line. This was the hidden war. While the headlines focused on the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the women of Hartford were fighting their own battle against time, fatigue, and social prejudice. They were proving, for the first time on such a massive scale, that precision engineering was not a gendered skill. It was a matter of discipline and will. As the summer of 1918 turned to fall, the factory reached its zenith. 10,000 workers, nearly half of them women, were producing a finished M1911 every minute. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a slogan. It was a screaming, smoking, steel-producing reality. But even as they reached this peak, the world was about to change again. The thunder of the guns in Europe was beginning to fade, and the women of Colt would soon find out that their service, while vital, was considered by many to be temporary. If you believe that the history of war is as much about the factory as it is about the front line, please leave a comment below. Which part of the M1911 production do you think was the hardest to master? On November 11th, 1918, at precisely 11 a.m., the world went silent. In the trenches of France, the roar of the artillery ceased. But in Hartford, Connecticut, the silence was even more jarring. Within hours of the armistice being signed, the telegrams from Washington changed their tone. The word urgent was replaced by cancel. The great mechanical beast that was the Colt factory didn't just slow down, it ground to a violent halt. The government, which only weeks before had been screaming for millions of pistols, suddenly found itself with a surplus of steel and a massive debt. For the 10,000 workers at Colt, the celebration of peace was almost immediately followed by the cold reality of unemployment. The lady soldiers were the first to go. As the troop ships began returning to New York Harbor, the social contract changed overnight. The same propaganda that had called them heroes now suggested that their patriotic duty was to return to the kitchen and the nursery to make room for the returning men. Within months, the vibrant, diverse sisterhood of the machine shop was dismantled. They left behind their denim aprons and their grease-stained caps. Carrying only the memories of the year, they held the defense of the nation in their hands. For the Colt Company, the post-war era was a descent into the valley of shadow. They were left with massive factory wings, expensive specialized machinery that could only build guns, and a market flooded with surplus M1911s. The company that had bet its entire future on the war now faced a world that didn't want to fight anymore. But while the factory struggled, the weapon itself began its second life. The soldiers who came home didn't forget the heavy, reliable weight on their hips. They had seen the M1911 perform in conditions that would have killed any other machine. They had seen it work in the freezing mud of the Argonne and the chemical clouds of mustard gas. The 1911 wasn't just a tool to them, it was a talisman. It was the old war horse. John Moses Browning's masterpiece survived the post-war budget cuts because it was simply too good to replace. It would go on to serve through the jungles of Guadalcanal, the frozen ridges of Chosin, and the humid deltas of Vietnam. It would be copied by every major firearms manufacturer in the world, yet the original Colt blueprints would remain the gold standard for over a century. What happened to the Hartford plant? The Blue Onion Dome still stands today, a silent sentinel over the Connecticut River. It is no longer a city of fire and steel. Parts of it are now luxury apartments and offices. People sleep and work in the same spaces where, a century ago, women in caps dodged leather belts and men forged the steel that won a world war. If you walk through those halls today, you won't hear the roar of the drop forges, but if you listen closely, you can still feel the vibration of an era when America transformed itself from a collection of farms into an industrial titan. The M1911 is more than a firearm. It is a physical record of the 1917 crisis. It is a testament to the genius of a Mormon inventor from Utah, the grit of immigrant workers, and the courage of women who stepped into the light when the world went dark. It is a legend born in Hartford, forged in fire and tempered by the blood of millions. The war to end all wars did not end all wars, but it gave birth to a mechanical icon that, even 100 years later, still speaks with the thunder of the American spirit. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the halls of Station 47. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the industrial soul of the M1911, don't forget to like and share. The history of steel is the history of us.